Good afternoon, students. This second video focuses on the human rights crisis in Central America and the crisis at the US-Mexico border. So I do want to start with stories. You might be getting tired of stories by now, but stories are important, right? We all agree on that. And I have been directly working with Central American asylum seekers in a particular mission and ministry since 2014. So I actually have a lot of stories. I'm only going to tell you 3 of them, but I think that those 3 stories ground us in the reality that I'm then going to back up and frame for you. So if you were going on a short-term mission trip with the Lutheran Church in El Salvador, you would probably stay at the Lutheran guest home, which is run by that little abuela in front, the little grandmother named Trinidad, and that's her whole family around her, and they help her run it. Well, the boy that you would see on your far right, in that picture, he was 14. His name is Josue. And in the smaller picture, you see his father, Roberto, who is working there as a truck driver. So I just want to introduce you to the characters in the story. So Josue is a bright kid, and so he was going to high school, which is not assumed in Central America since you have to pay for it. But the family was pulling resources so that he could go to high school. Well, one day, right after school, he was starting to come home, and 2 boys came up to him and they asked him to join the Mara Salvatrucha, which you might have heard of as MS-13. Well, when they ask, that's not, it's actually not a question that you can answer no to. In fact, they tell you that you have 3 choices. You can run, you can die, or you can join. And at that particular point, they were saying that if you say you're going to join, you have to show you're serious by being willing to kill a member of your extended family. So Josue did not want to do any one of those things. And he thought, what am I going to do? He said, my father is a strong man. He's a man of God. He's strong spiritually. He's strong physically. I'm going to ask him what to do, and he will have an answer. So Josue went running home, and his father, sure enough, had just gotten home from work. And he came outside, and he said to the 2 boys who were behind Josue, he said to them, my son is a Christian. You can't have him. Whereupon one of them took out a pistol and shot his father dead in the street. And the next day, Josue became one of the unaccompanied migrant minors running for the border. And part of why he was running for the border with the U.S. in particular was because his mother was here and had been here for a number of years. So because of the story that you all read earlier in Harvest of Empire, there's the largest population of Salvadorans in the world next to El Salvador is in the United States. So I want to go on. I want to tell you 2 more stories. One of them is just a report from the Associated Press, but I think it's just really speaks very well to the situation of girls, because I've been talking, Josue's situation is very typical for a boy, but I want you to hear the situation for girls. The girl is dead. She's 15 years old and her name is Marcela. Witnesses tell us she was executed by a gang member. We can't see her face. All we can see is her plaid pants and gray t-shirt. Her family is across the street in a pickup truck. We can't tell you their names because it would put them in danger. Marcela's mother is too upset to talk, so we talked to her grandmother. She says Marcela left the house that morning with her sister. The 2 worked in downtown San Salvador, the capital of El Salvador, making tortillas. The grandmother tells us that Marcela's boyfriend was a bus driver in a gang-controlled neighborhood. First, he got threats. Help the gang or we'll kill you. Then he disappeared. Then Marcela started getting threats. And now this. Marcela's body lying on the ground while people drive to work. We find the police investigator on the case. He says Marcela was attacked from behind and shot twice in the head. He says Marcela's sister witnessed the killing. She's now in police protection. We ask him why a gang member would kill a 15-year-old girl. He speculates that it's because she didn't want to be someone's girlfriend or didn't want to do something for that gang. Is this normal, we ask? Does it happen to young women a lot? It happens every day, he says. The police later release Marcela's sister from their protection, even though local reporters tell us the gangs will probably go after her now. The family tells us their only option is to leave the country, ideally for the United States, but they've got about $200 to their name, and it's not nearly enough to pay a smuggler. So those are the boys and girls, but it's not only boys and girls that come. It is whole families, and particularly families headed by women. As you read, most refugees are women and children. So I just want to read you a story from one of the mothers that we were working with, and I'm going to read it in her words, even though I actually know it. I could tell it in my own words, but she says it more powerfully. I cannot return to El Salvador, or the MS-13 gang will kidnap my daughter and kill me. I come from a humble background, and I worked hard to open my own small store to support my family. MS-13 started taking over my neighborhood, and everyone lived in fear of the gang members. The gang members would come into my store and take things without paying. They would also ask for money almost daily and raise the amount they demanded constantly. They were demanding more than what I could give, so I was forced to close my store. The MS-13 gang was very angry that I closed the store and demanded 7,000 American dollars, or they would kidnap my 8-year-old daughter. They said she was very pretty and they could do a lot of things with her. They also said that if I were to go to the police, they would kill me and my other children. I would not have gone to the police anyway because they are connected with the gangs and often tell the gang members when victims report crimes. The gangs have killed many people who have tried to cooperate with the police. I know I can't go anywhere else in El Salvador because MS-13 is everywhere, and others who have tried to flee to other parts of the country following similar threats have been found and killed. After the gangs threatened to kidnap my daughter, I could not send her to school anymore. We fled to the United States and asked for protection at the border. We were detained in freezing cold rooms and given very little food to eat. The gangs have now started targeting my mother, and I'm afraid that she will be hurt or killed because I left. So again, let's hold these people in our hearts and prayers as we look at the bigger picture. So in Harvest of Empire, you learned about Central America and the U.S. role in Central America up until 1992. The Civil Wars, by the way, in Guatemala and in El Salvador ended when the U.S. funding ended. So when networks in this country, which were particularly strong in the churches, when networks advocated and were able to stop the funding to the government, then the warring sides had to make peace, and they did. However, the economies were devastated, and there were generations whose most common skill was killing, either for the government or in the rebel armies. The war in El Salvador lasted 16 years, and the war in Guatemala 30 years. So that's generations, right? Remember, the Marshall Plan was money that was invested to rebuild Europe after the war. There was no Marshall Plan for Central America. Wherever there was development funding, we do have small-scale success stories. Some of which are relatively recent, some of them under the Obama administration. So development is critically important, but there was the money was insufficient and basically stopped during the Trump administration. There was some money given that was contingent on stopping refugees from leaving, but other than that, the money was cut way back. So that leaves very fruitful ground for organized crime. So there are these huge, some of the most powerful international organized crime syndicates we've ever seen globally. And they survive on guns, drugs, and human trafficking, mostly to the United States. And there have been these odd little policy wrinkles that have actually strengthened the gang. So for example, in the 1996 Comprehensive Immigration Reform, there was a little clause that could take permanent resident status away from anyone with a gang affiliation. Well, when the Central Americans first came to the United States, they had a lot of trouble during the Civil War getting political asylum because the U.S. was in an ally relationship with the governments, and therefore was very unwilling to recognize that those governments, in fact, were involved in the persecution of their population. So it was very, very difficult to get political asylum, and people were living in the shadows and working multiple jobs to survive and living in very poor areas. And when their children began to be preyed upon by the local gangs who did not allow them to join. And so they formed their own gang in Los Angeles in the Pico Union area called the Mara Salvatrucha. And then the gang was formed for protection, right? And then under that 1995 legislation, the majority of the gang members at that time were deported to El Salvador, where they no longer had family and where they were deported essentially right into the arms of organized crime. So just, these little unintended consequences of policy decisions. So the situation that the stories that I just shared with you, of course, come from fragile states who are unable to rein in the power of organized crime. And in some of those fragile states, like Honduras, the presidential family has a long history of direct involvement with the organized crime syndicates. So that, of course, makes the situation even worse. So let's talk a little bit about what's happening at the border. So I mentioned that that there are many people who are running who have family ties in the United States. So it is natural for them to go to the United States. It is also completely legal, because of the Refugee Act of 1980, for them to come to the border and to step one foot over and to petition for asylum. Under the Trump administration in particular, they were portrayed as illegals, but in fact, that is a completely legal move. And there was a policy under the Trump administration that made gang threats an unacceptable reason for petitioning for asylum, as if the only threat to somebody that would make them eligible for asylum would be a direct threat from the government. But in fact, we're facing a situation in the 21st century where there are non-governmental organizations, whether we're talking about ISIS or whether we're talking about the Mara Salvatrucha, that essentially operate as governments in these fragile states. And that, in fact, what is happening in Central America, is that organized crime in many areas is the government. Now, this has been a crisis that has been a long time in coming, but it exploded in 2014. And I've heard a number of different analyses for this. I'm not completely sure myself why, but I've read articles which talk about the Zetas, the narcotraficantes in Mexico, subcontracting when Mexico began to clean up or control their drug cartels, that those drug cartels subcontracted with the Mara Salvatrucha and other ones of these organized crime cartels in Central America. So that's one story. The opioid crisis is another story. There was a coffee collapse, a collapse of the coffee industry that was caused by global warming, apparently. But for whatever reason, there was a sort of cancerous growth spurt that happened in 2014. And so that's when we began to see large numbers of unaccompanied migrant minors arriving at the border. Over the years, there has been a shift. I talk about Central America in the primary source of migration. One of those smaller scale development experiments under the Obama administration focused on El Salvador and cut the number of people coming from El Salvador in half in 1 year. Of course, the Trump administration changed that policy, but the truth is that most of the people right now from Central America at the border are from Honduras. And that's a direct result of Honduran corruption. So you have a shift. You had El Salvador was the primary source for a while, then Guatemala, and then Honduras. There are still people coming from all three, but it's primarily Honduras. There are also Haitians, and right now, of course, more than ever, and people coming from Africa. When the numbers of refugees that were allowed in from other countries was sharply curtailed under the Trump administration, going from almost 100,000 a year to 17,000, 18,000 a year. Then people who would normally have come in through the typical refugee system instead found their way to our southern border. And some of that is still going on. Now, part of what's true for people coming from Central America is that there's no safe third country for most of them. Because Mexico, for example, the Zetas do have an active relationship with the Mara Salvatrucha. And so if you are actually prominent enough to be individually targeted, you're not safe in Mexico. But that's, of course, not the only reason why people want to come to the U.S. It's also, like I said, because they have family ties, and family ties mean jobs, mean introduction to the culture, as we read about in migration theory. Of course, the border crisis has been worsened by political manipulation. Under the Obama administration, they were processing about 300 people a day at the border. So processing means that the vetting process starts. Some people don't even get into the vetting process because they fail the first credible fear test. Some people get into the vetting process, but they were being processed. Being processed doesn't mean that you stay, but it does mean that you start the processing. But under the Trump administration, that went down from 300 people a day to 20 people a day. So that created large visible lines on the Mexican side of the border, which of course created fear in people in this country, that they began to see that as an invasion. So political manipulation plays into the crisis at the border. Having people stay in Mexico, which was also another policy of the Trump administration that the current Biden administration is fighting, but the courts have continued to enforce, is to have people wait by the border in Mexico. And that, again, makes this visual of large numbers of people sitting there waiting to invade. So that actually worsens the crisis. So what are the options for asylum seekers? Because if you ask for asylum from a refugee camp, you don't get to come to the country that you've asked for asylum from until you are declared somebody who is recognized as being worthy of asylum. So that's when you're called a refugee. But what happens when you ask for asylum at a border? Well, you have to go through a vetting process. So what do they do with you during the vetting process? They can actually just parole you. They can decide that you would just live in the society and have a work permit and wait. That's what used to happen, actually, before the Obama administration. Then under the Obama administration, it became very popular to parole with electronic ankle bracelets for monitoring. And that has a very high rate of success. About, I think, 96% of the people who have those electronic ankle bracelets do come back for their courts. You could also parole with expensive bonds. That's another way of encouraging people to come back, although it means that most people don't get out. You can parole in Mexico, which is what I was talking about, where you keep them in Mexico. You can also detain them. And one of the human rights issues with detention is that it's essentially unlimited. You can also separate families. The Flores decision was a legal decision under actually the Obama administration, which said that you couldn't hold children indefinitely in detention. So family separation was a way of holding some people indefinitely in detention and putting other people in either out of detention in the community, or in the case of children, putting them into the ORR system, where they could end up deported, could end up being shuffled around to different detention centers, could end up in short-term foster care, could end up in long-term foster care. In 2017, when the Trump administration separated large numbers of families as a deterrent, part of what they did that was unconscionable from a human rights perspective is they didn't keep good records on which children went with which families. And so there are still families being reunited from 2017. Now, of course, when you're in immigration detention, you're not there because you've committed a crime. You're there because they're trying to figure out what to do with you while you are in the asylum process. Now, I'm not saying that everybody in immigration detention is in that circumstance, but everybody who's asking for asylum, who's in immigration detention, is in that circumstance, that they have not committed any crime. They're just being held pending a decision. Well, of course, that was an absolute tragedy under the worst of COVID, because it was like standing there watching a freight train come at you when there had been nothing that you had done to deserve that. So a number of us around the country worked very hard to get asylum seekers out of detention and into electronic ankle bracelet monitoring during the worst of COVID. During the Trump administration, they called that catch and release electronic ankle, as if people were fish, and made it very difficult, but we won a number of cases. So I just wanted to, I think this is a very important case study. I could have also used a case study from asylum at the border of Hungary or the border of Italy, but you can all go research that if you're interested. That's also a really important case study. What happened with the Syrian refugees who were coming to the borders of Europe and asking for asylum. What's not what happened, what's still happening, just as it's still happening on this border. So look forward to your comments as always.